good interaction in the left out 3-4 minutes. So if it is possible, I will certainly appreciate. Dr. Naik, you can start.
Thank you, sir, for the kind introduction. I would definitely try to finish the talk in time. This talk is, I think, pertinent more for the pulmonologists and intervention pulmonologists, and equally relevant for all the oncologists which are present over here. So we will be speaking about and discussing about the role of endobronchial ultrasound-guided transbronchial needle aspiration of the mediastinum, which is required for the diagnosis as well as staging for non-small cell lung cancers. So a basic outline of this talk would be how do you stage the mediastinum, what is the importance of staging the mediastinum in this group of patients, what are the different types of staging methodologies which are available, what are the indications. Then once we have discussed all of this, we'll come to the different endoscopic techniques, because that is the focus of this presentation, which includes endobronchial ultrasound, endoscopic ultrasound, and the combination of the two. Since EBUS is the focus of this particular talk, the utility of EBUS in different specific situations like clinical N0, N1 stage cancers, clinical N2, N3 stage cancers, and restaging of mediastinum. Then we'll have a look at the staging algorithms, the controversy surrounding this topic, and we'll finish up with a clinical example of how and when and what to do when we are facing a patient in whom an EBUS TPNA has to be performed. So starting with the mediastinal staging importance, this paper was published very recently in the Respirology Journal in 2020, and this essentially emphasizes the importance of staging of the mediastinum when we are dealing with patients of non-small cell lung cancer, and also emphasizes the fact that it is no more a one-man show, it is no more a domain of the thoracic surgeon, but it has to be a multidisciplinary kind of effort. So why it is important? So, mediastinal staging is important because of it is crucial for determining the treatment and prognosis of non-small cell lung cancer. And in non-metastatic disease, we are very well aware that lymph node status is the most important predictor of prognosis, as well as it helps in the most important factor for therapeutic decision making as well. Because we are aware that surgical resection is the treatment of choice as far as clinical N0, N1 stage cancers are concerned, and N2 and 3 stage cancers, definitive CTRTs are standard of care. It also helps in excluding with the highest certainty those patients which will not be benefited by surgery, and helps in picking up those patients who will definitely be benefited by definitive intervention with surgery. As we have already discussed, it is no more the domain of the thoracic surgeon. Now the thoracic surgeon, the pulmonologist, radiologist, nuclear medicine specialist, oncologist, radiation oncologist, all of the oncologists, all of them are a very important and vital constituent of the multidisciplinary team which discusses what exactly has to be done as far as the staging of the mediastinum is concerned in these patients. It enhances the staging and adherence to guidelines, the clinical outcomes, as well as the survival. The current evidence-based guidelines, which includes the ESCS guidelines, the ECCP and the NCCN 2019 guidelines, state for preoperative staging of non-small cell lung cancer, they recommend that staging should be performed with increasing invasiveness. We'll come to this in a couple of slides down the line. And endoscopy-based techniques definitely play a very central role as of the recent guidelines. So now talking about the different types of the mediastinal staging which has been described. So there are two basic types. One is the imaging or the non-invasive based staging methods, and second is the invasive based staging methods. So non-invasive includes all the imaging parameters, which includes image-based CT, MRI, metabolism-based PET CT, and a combination of the two, which is basically PET combined with CT. The focus of this presentation is essentially endoscopy-based, which comes under the domain of the invasive methods of mediastinal staging. The invasive methods could be two. The gold standard is surgical staging, and the other one is endoscopy-based. cTBNA, which stands for conventional TBNA, that is out of picture anymore. EUS-FNA or EUS-BFNA is one of the endoscopic modalities, and EBUS-TBNA, a combination of the two. So invasive is definitely must. Whatever we see on the non-invasive imaging picture, that has to be sampled in most of the cases, and you have to prove that whether metastasis is present or not. But when do the guidelines say that you need not always go for the invasive method? So current guidelines actually recommend proceeding to invasive mediastinal staging in almost all the cases. But if the tumor is small, it's peripherally located in the clinical stage 1, and has no PET CT detectable lymph nodes within the mediastinum or the hilum, then invasive pre-op nodal evaluation is not recommended as per the recent guidelines. The reason behind this recommendation is that PET scan has a false negative rate of only around 6% in this population of patients, but definitely non-surgical candidates, EVA staging is warranted to confirm involvement of the lymph nodes before subjecting the patient to SBRT. The ACCP 2013 guidelines have also waived off invasive mediastinal staging in one more recommendation in which there is extensive mediastinal involvement. So what are the indications? When do we actually need to do invasive testing of the mediastinum? So one is definitely if we find abnormal lymph nodes within the mediastinum. By abnormal lymph nodes, we mean that the lymph nodes are either more than 10 mm in size or they are PET avid. Plus, if the lymph nodes are not avid, if they are not detected on the PET or the CT scan, then what are the indications? So there are 3 or 4 indications which have been mentioned. The first is central tumors. The second is radiologically N0 tumors with a size more than 3 centimeters. The third is radiologically N1 tumors. Then any mediastinal node which is more than 1 centimeter in size, irrespective of the avidity. And lastly, in some cases of adenocarcinomas which have a low metabolic activity, this invasive mediastinal staging may be recommended because it is associated with occult N2 disease. Let's have a look at this beautiful graphic which has been shown over here. So if you see, the figure A actually shows a mediastinal invasion by the primary tumor, and that lymph nodes are not correctly and properly discernible over here, which means that you cannot measure the dimensions of the lymph nodes, and this is the group in which the ACCP 2013 guidelines says that invasive mediastinal staging is not indicated. The other group, I would like to bring your attention to the group D, which has been depicted in figure E, in which we have a small tumor which is peripherally located. It is a clinical stage 1 tumor. There are no detectable lymph nodes on the PET-CT, and therefore this also falls in the domain where an invasive mediastinal staging is not recommended. The other two are group B, which is depicted over here. You can definitively see that well discernible and properly visible lymph nodes in the mediastinum. These you can easily measure, and definitely an invasive mediastinal sampling is recommended over here. Similarly, in these two also, the tumors are over there, but mediastinal lymph nodes are not very well appreciable. But both of these fall in the category of high risk for N2 disease. So that is why in the example shown in picture C, there is N1 involvement, which again is a high risk for N2 disease. And in pictures D, we see that the tumor is actually central, and central tumor definitely is a high risk for N2 disease. So all of these, both of these should be ideally sampled by invasive methods. So let's quickly see what are the different endoscopic techniques. So 3 we have already spoken about. Our focus would be mainly on EBUS. But before we go on to that, let's see what are the different, which we have already discussed, the non-invasive and the invasive methods. Our focus is on endoscopy-based methods. So let's see what are the different pros and cons of these methods. The important things about the endoscopy-based methods are they are minimally invasive. They can sample those lymph nodes which cannot be sampled by mediastinoscopy, like the hilar and the interlobar. They can be done without requirement of general anesthesia, and they can also be easily used for restaging. Sometimes the sampling of the lymph nodes may be partial, and the negative findings are often required to be confirmed with the help of invasive surgical methods. If you look at the sensitivity and specificity of the different endoscopic methods, we find that it is around 89% for both EBUS and EUS when they are performed independently and alone, which is comparable to the mediastinoscopic methods. And if they are combined together, they reach almost more than 90%, which is a decent sensitivity figure. So how safe are these procedures? So this paper was published recently in Respiration in 2014, which focuses exclusively on the complication rates of endosonographic methods for mediastinal staging. And this says that after reviewing almost 16,000 patients, they say that it is a very safe procedure. Overall rate of severe adverse events was around 0.14% and was more frequent with EUS as compared to EBUS TBNA. The serious adverse effects were mostly in the form of infectious adverse effects, and the frequency was around 0.07%. EUS FNA evidence actually comes from this important paper from CHEST in 2007. It can stage all the left-sided lymph nodes, 2L, 4L, 7, 5, 8, 9. It has a decent sensitivity of around 0.83 and pool specificity of around 0.97. On the other hand, if we focus on EBUS TBNA, the evidence comes from this important systematic review published in European Journal of Cancer in 2009. It provides a good pool sensitivity of 0.93, which is better than that of EUS FNA, a specificity of around 1. So, this EBUS TBNA can additionally sample stations which are present on the right hand side. For example, 2R, 4R, in addition to the ones which are sampled, being able to be sampled by the EUS method. A couple of important systematic reviews and meta-analyses have also supported other important benefits of going for the endoscopic methods of staging. They have reduced complications, morbidity and mortality. They are safe and equally effective. They reduce the need of invasive surgical diagnostic procedures, and they help in faster decision making at no additional cost. And that is why these methods have superseded mediastinoscopy as the recommended first test for preoperative staging in patients with radiologically abnormal mediastinum. A combination of the two has been backed by evidence with the help of these two recent studies. They say that a combination of EUS with EBUS definitely increases the domain of sampling of the lymph nodes stations which are present within the mediastinum, and thus the diagnostic yield of each procedure being performed alone is complementarily increased. Now there is a concept of thoroughness. Thoroughness in invasive staging. So thoroughness technically by dictionary means how aggressive and how meticulously we have sampled the mediastinum. So important point about thoroughness is that there are two important points that I would like your attention to be focused on. One is selective, which is essentially based on the imaging that we have. We have positive signs of involvement on imaging, and those are the lymph nodes which we decide in the bronchoscopy room to sample by EBUS TBNA. The second is systematic sampling, in which we go for systematic screening of all the lymph node stations. Whatever we find and whatever we pick up during the screening, we sample all of these. So this definitely has an edge, and this has been described for all the different methods. The thoroughness has been described for all different methods of staging, which includes the imaging methods, surgical methods, and endoscopic methods. But because the focus of our talk is endoscopy, so let's see what the guidelines recommend. The guidelines recommend a complete assessment of the mediastinal and hilar stations, at least the 4R, 4L, and 7 stations. So this is the basic minimum which is required for systematic assessment of the mediastinum. So potentially surgical conditions, specific potentially surgical conditions where EBUS plays a good role. So these are three. One is clinically N0, N1 stage disease, which is radiologically normal mediastinum. Second is clinically N2, N3 disease, which is radiologically abnormal mediastinum. And third is for restaging. So we'll see quickly which ones, what role EBUS has in each of these. So the first and the foremost and most important, I would say, is the clinically N0, N1 disease, which is radiologically normal mediastinum. So the evidence comes up from this important original research, which was published in 2008 in CHEST, and they aim to determine the results of EBUS TBNA in this population, and they subjected each of the included patients to systematic EBUS TBNA examination followed by systematic subsequent surgical staging for each of these patients. And then the yields of the two methods were compared, and they found that the sensitivity was 89% for EBUS, specificity was 100%, and negative predictive value was almost 99%. And they concluded that EBUS can be used to accurately sample and stage patients with stage 1 NSCLC and radiologically normal mediastinum. So this was an original research. Now let's talk about what the systematic reviews and meta-analyses say. So these are two important studies published recently in 2018 and 2019, which focus about the role of EBUS in this group of patients. Both of them say that the EBUS has a low sensitivity of around 0.49, but a high negative predictive value, around 91 to 93%. This marked reduction of sensitivity actually highlights in these papers the importance of thoroughness of staging in this population, because more than half of these patients were subjected to only sampling of 2 lymph nodes per station in the procedure. So they concluded that sampling of 1 or 2 lymph nodes per patient can be enough, although suboptimal, to diagnose mediastinal involvement, but absolutely insufficient in those with a normal lymph node picture on the CT. Also, an important fact is that post-surgical upstaging to pathological N2 disease occurs in almost 35 to 37% of these patients. So these facts actually underscore the importance of systematic pre-operative pathological staging of clinical N0, N1 disease. let's look at the role of EBUS in the second group of patients, which is radiologically abnormal mediastinum, that is clinical N2, N3 disease. So the evidence comes up from this important paper, which was a systematic review of around 11 studies focusing on almost 1,300 patients, in which they performed both EBUS as well as EUS, and they found that the pooled sensitivity and specificity of these procedures was around 93 and 100% respectively, and the complication rates were negligible. A second systematic review, which was published in 2013, also supported these findings and included studies only which performed EBUS and not EUS. So the combined sensitivity and specificity in this review was 90 and 99%, and complication rates were very, very less. So both of these concluded that in pre-treatment mediastinal staging of clinical N2, N3 disease, endosonographic procedures are definitely safe and have a high sensitivity and specificity. Third category and the last one is, what is the role of EBUS in restaging of the mediastinum after a patient undergoes neoadjuvant chemotherapy? So this is a specific category of patients who have been staged by some method, either invasive surgical method or by an endoscopic method, to arrive at a diagnosis of non-small cell lung cancer and to label them as having a stage 3A N2. So these are those subsets for which a decision has been taken to subject them to neoadjuvant chemotherapy, followed by reassessment for being eligible for surgery or not. Now, for reassessment, a restaging is actually required. If these patients require restaging, and if they are restaged with the help of surgery, it becomes technically challenging and difficult because of the previous staging that has already happened at the time of diagnosis, or because of the NACT that they have to receive. There could be extensive fibrosis and adhesions within the thorax, because of which a restaging with the help of surgery would be much difficult. Here comes the role of endosonographic methods, and that is why they have been labeled as to be useful to successfully restage these patients and that find out the correct stage. The evidence for this comes up from this important review, which was published very recently last year in the journal Mediastinum. They focused on the sensitivity, specificity, and accuracy, and they have documented nice figures for EBUS and EUS as far as restaging of the mediastinum is concerned in post-NACT patients. But let's have a look at these two important systematic review and meta-analysis, one of which was published from India itself in the journal Chest in 2018. And they studied, did a review of around 10 studies, almost 600 patients. Sure, sir. The mediastinal restaging was done with EBUS and EUS, and the sensitivity and specificity was found to be around 67 and 99%. And it was concluded that for restaging also EBUS definitely plays a gold standard role. We'll rush through the staging algorithms. There have been a number of them, but I'll just quickly come to the most comprehensive one. On the right-hand side, so you can see if the imaging shows positive lymph nodes, they have to be confirmed with the help of EBUS. If the EBUS comes out to be negative, a mediastinoscopy needs to be done, and that also comes out to be negative, surgical candidate. You can label that person as a surgical candidate. On the other hand, if EBUS comes out to be positive, then the multimodality treatment has to be offered. If the imaging does not reveal any lymph nodes and the lymph nodes are clinically N0, peripheral, and less than 3 centimeters, direct surgery can be taken up. But if they are suspected for N2 disease, tissue confirmation is again warranted with the help of EBUS. If that comes out to be positive, multimodality therapy, and if that comes out to be negative, then they can be taken up for surgery. Just one controversy I would like to highlight, which is confirmatory mediastinoscopy, whether it is required after negative EBUS examination or not. So a number of trials have been published. The one was ASTER-1, published in JAMA 2010, ASTER-2 in CHEST 2015, and a meta-analysis in JTO in 2019. All of these actually say that a confirmatory mediastinoscopy definitely adds to the sensitivity of doing an EBUS examination alone. What do the guidelines say? The ESTS 2014 recommends proceeding to a confirmatory mediastinoscopy after an EBUS examination, because that helps in essentially finding out which patients have been missed out by EBUS, and then a definitive call for the definitive therapy or otherwise can be taken. Last, the clinical example. This is a beautiful example. A 69-year-old man who was a smoker incidentally found to have a lesion of the superior segment of the right upper lobe. You can see the lesion over here. This is the lesion. It is a central tumor. This is only the lung window. The mediastinal window did not show any enlarged mediastinal lymph nodes. He was subjected to an EBUS TVNA of the main mass lesion. You can see the EBUS image, the ultrasonic image of the mass and the needle within the image, and the sampling of the main mass was done. Then the staging of the mass lesion was done. Remember, the primary tumor is on the right side in this upper lobe, and it is central. So how was the staging done? This is a beautiful diagram which shows that the staging has to proceed from N3. We are almost done. I'm so sorry. So N3, N2, N1. That is the order in which you need to restage. I would not go into the details much because I'm short of time. Take home messages, quite a lot of them. Important thing is that mediastinum staging definitely has to be taken care of because it is crucial in the management of these patients, and EBUS definitely plays a very important role as far as staging of these patients is concerned. I'm sorry for shooting over the time, but I would definitely like to acknowledge Dr. Sajjan Rajpurohit for giving me this opportunity, Dr. Amit Sehrawat, who extended the invitation for this CME, and my DM fellow resident, Dr. Prakash, who did the initial literature search as well as provided me with the initial draft of this presentation. Thank you so much. If there are any questions, please come up.
So we can have just one or two questions. Yes, Amit.
What size of lymph node you are not comfortable with?
So that is a very beautiful question. As far as international data is concerned, studies have sampled as small as 5 to 6 millimeters of lymph nodes. Currently, we are sampling anyway above more than 8 millimeters.
So Mac, one question from my side. Like we always teach our students, apart from size, there are other criteria of abnormality. For example, the shape and the enhancement, peripheral enhancement. So do you also take these things into account?
So actually, there are 6 criteria, sir, and we take all of these into account while staging our patients.
Postgraduate students are sitting here.
So these 6 criteria are actually the shape of the lymph nodes, whether it is round or oval, because this round shape is a predictor for malignancy. Then size of the lymph node, anyone which is more than 1 centimeter, that is 10 millimeters, definitely has a high risk for malignancy. Then echogenicity, if it is homogeneous, then it has a low risk. If it is heterogeneous, it has a high risk. Then there are 2 important things: central hilar structure and coagulation necrosis sign. So central hilar structure, if it is present, that goes against malignancy. Coagulation necrosis sign, if it is present, that goes in favor of malignancy. These 5 or 6 criteria. I invite the students, if they are free, sometime they can come up in our bronchoscopy lab and they can see the EBUS procedure happen. We can show them the lymph nodes, these signs and all of these features, so that they also can identify which lymph nodes could sonographically look as metastatic or could sonographically look as benign.
So I think that's a good invitation for my students sitting here. They can find some time and coordinate with Dr. Mang and spend some time in EBUS room. So thank you, Dr. Mang.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Now I hand over the mic to my coach.
So we have been having really lovely evening today with such wonderful talks from eminent speakers, and I would really appreciate both Dr. Aparna Dhar as well as Dr. Mang for comprehensively covering their topics in the stipulated time. That's really kudos to you. Now we move on to more of core medical oncology, and I'll call upon Dr. Deepak Sundria. He is considered medical oncologist at AIIMS Rishikesh, and he'll be speaking upon newer paradigms in resected EGFR mutant early lung cancer. Over to you, Dr. Deepak.
Sir, and good evening all.
And okay, sir. We'll maintain the timelines.
We will be discussing what is currently going on in the management of early lung cancer. So as we all know that lung cancer is the leading cause of cancer death, and it's almost second to head and neck malignancy when absolute numbers are concerned or death is concerned. And it has been seen that almost 70% of the patients present in unresectable state. Almost 70% of the patients they present to us in unresectable state. But in our clinical practice, we have seen that only 10% of the patients actually reach us in a resectable state. So, as we go from stage 1 to stage 3, we see that the 5-year recurrence rate increases. It is almost 45% in stage 1B to 62% in stage 2, and reaches up to 76% in stage 3. In early stage, surgery is the primary modality of management, followed by adjuvant platinum combination. And even after giving adjuvant chemotherapy, we have seen that the overall survival still remains very weak. So what can be done to improve the survival? actually the tumorigenesis is driven by some mutations, as we all know, which include common mutations like EGFR mutations and L cross rearrangement, and then some other rare mutations. And this EGFR mutation is an early event in tumorigenesis, and this relative percentage is invariably fixed, almost ranging from 25% to 50%, whether it is stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 2. So it has been seen that EGFR mutation is almost seen up to the tune of 30 to 40% in Asian population, while it is less prevalent in Western population. Mostly 40% up to in females and those who are non-smokers. So, as we all know that the role of TKI is well established in the advanced stage, so it was hypothesized that even in the resectable setting, if we are offering EGFR TKI, similar proportion of patients may be able to get benefited by these TKI. So this was the hypothesis behind this trial known as ADAURA trial, which was osimertinib as an adjuvant therapy in patients with stage 1B to 3A patients in which there is EGFR mutation and who have been offered complete tumor resection. So this trial actually started in 2015. It was a multinational trial happening in most European and Asian countries. The final results are expected in 2022, but this was an unplanned interim analysis which was published in 2020 October in NEJM. So the inclusion criteria for this trial were age more than 18 years, a WHO performance status of 0 or 1, patients who have non-small cell, non-squamous lung cancer, who have exon 19 deletion or L858R 21 mutation, or who have been offered adjuvant chemotherapy without adjuvant chemotherapy, and the randomization has to be done within 10 weeks, or if they have been offered in adjuvant chemotherapy, the randomization has to be done within 20 weeks. Further stratification was done as per the stage, EGFR mutation or the race, and the endpoints were primary endpoint was disease-free survival in stage 2 and stage 3. It was a superiority design trial. Secondary endpoint was disease-free survival in overall population, and stage 1 was also included as a secondary endpoint. And then disease-free survival is 2, 3, 4 and 5 years. Overall survival, safety and health related to 12. However, this trial was not powered enough for overall survival, and just because there was evidence of superior efficacy, hence an unplanned interim analysis was published in year 2020. So baseline characteristics between the osimertinib and placebo arm were well matched as far as sex, age, smoking status, race, performance status, imaging, pathology or EGFR status is concerned, and these patients who were received adjuvant chemotherapy and those who were offered directly adjuvant TKI, they were also well matched. So coming to the efficacy analysis, so as we see that in patients who are offered osimertinib as compared to placebo, if we look at the primary endpoint of disease-free survival, we can see that these curves are starting separating it very early from the stage. So a hazard ratio of 0.17 for the primary event of reduction in disease recurrence or death was noticed, which translates to a reduction of 83% of the primary event, and similar 80% reduction in the risk of disease recurrence or death was noticed in as a secondary event in disease-free survival, which includes stage 1B, 2 and stage 3 also. So this disease-free survival event was very consistent. If we see all stages, in stage 1B it was 88%, stage 2 91%, and in stage 3 it was 88%. While it reduced drastically from 71% in the placebo arm in stage 1B to 32% in stage 3 arm. So if we do a subgroup analysis for osimertinib versus placebo, and if we compare sex, age, smoking history, stage or EGFR mutation or adjuvant chemotherapy, we can see that all were favoring the osimertinib. So this is the the overall survival Kepler main plot for this osimertinib versus placebo, but as you can see that the results are not very much significant. It was because this was an unplanned interim analysis and this trial was not powered enough to look for overall survival. So, as we all know, it is not something new that TKI has been given in an adjuvant setting. Prior also, erlotinib, gefitinib and other TKIs have also been tried in adjuvant setting in trial like Select, Radiant, IVAN or CR19. But the main difference was that in these trials, only a few established a clinically meaningful DFS, while in few trials, DFS was not significant. None of them had a significant overall survival improvement, and one more important point that CNS events were very much in number in all these TKI trials. So what is unique to this osimertinib molecule? So first of all, osimertinib is more efficacious as compared to erlotinib or gefitinib. Second, the brain penetration, CNS penetration of osimertinib is very high as compared to erlotinib or gefitinib. Third, it targets T790M mutation. As already discussed, it is one of the most common mutations after the primary use of TKI. However, it can also be seen as an early event in patients who have been not exposed to TKI. CNS is a common site of distant recurrence in adjuvant, as shown in adjuvant Radiant study. 37% of the recurrent patients were patients who were treated with erlotinib, they had CNS tumor. So in the advanced NSCLC setting, like in metastatic malignancy, first line osimertinib have already demonstrated superior overall survival and a 52% reduction in the risk of CNS progression as compared with erlotinib or gefitinib. So if we compare the type of disease recurrence, we can see that in the osimertinib arm, only 11% of the population had a DFS event as compared to almost 46% of the patients in the placebo arm. And most of these recurrence in the osimertinib arm were of local or regional recurrence only, as compared to 61% of the mutation in the distant recurrence in the placebo arm. This point is very important because local regional recurrence is usually associated with a longer post-recurrence survival as compared to a distant recurrence. So if we look at various sites of recurrence, we can see that only 1% of the patients in the osimertinib arm have a CNS recurrence as compared to 10% of the patients in the placebo. So it is very much clear that osimertinib is an efficacious and potent drug in preventing CNS recurrence. So this is the disease-free survival in the CNS status in the overall population, and you can very well see that the median DFS was not reached in the osimertinib arm as compared to placebo. If we look at the safety profile, then we can see that there was no death which was attributable to any adverse event in the osimertinib arm, and adverse event leading to discontinuation was seen only in 11% of the population in osimertinib arm, and dose reduction was required only in 7% of the population. So this is a very, very safe drug. So adverse events were mostly in the form of diarrhea, paronychia, dry skin, pruritus, cough, stomatitis, nasopharyngitis, diffuse hepatitis or upper respiratory infection, and mostly they were of lower grade. Only few like 2% in diarrhea, 1% or in 2% of the cases were of grade 3 and 4. After this trial, two more updates were published in the Journal of Thoracic Oncology, and these were regarding the post-operative chemotherapy use and outcome. So patients who have received chemotherapy in the post-operative setting, so how did they fare with the ADAURA trial? This was reported in these two updates. So almost 60% of the patients had received adjuvant chemotherapy for a median duration of 4 cycles, and these were mostly patients who were under 70 years of age and mostly with stage 2 and 3. And again, we can very well see that even patients who are offered chemotherapy, the curve starts at and a median DFS of 22 months in placebo was reported, while it was not released in osimertinib. So again, if we stratify them, then again the hazard ratios are favoring again in favor of osimertinib. Clinically meaningful DFS benefit was observed in patients who had received osimertinib, whether irrespective of their chemotherapy. So this was in stage 1B, stage 2, stage 3. Whether if you are giving chemotherapy or if you are not giving chemotherapy does not matter much. The osimertinib increasing the disease-free interval is most important. Another update was regarding patient-reported outcomes from Medara trial. This was again published in the Journal of Forensic Oncology, and this was regarding health-related quality of life in patients with while using an SF-36 survey. And this survey was very much appreciated in the both arms, and high compliance rate of almost 90 to 100% was reached in both osimertinib as well as fixed. This survey included two major categories regarding the physical condition of the patient or the mental condition of the patient, and as we can see that there was actually no difference in the PCS or MCS component in both of the arms regarding osimertinib or placebo. Meaning that the majority of the patient, more than 80% of the patient across both arms actually did not experience any deterioration in PCS or MCS component. So just to conclude, adjuvant osimertinib is the first targeted treatment which has shown a statistically significant and clinically meaningful improvement in disease survival in patients with stage 1, 2 or stage 3 resectable non-small cell lung cancer who have EGFR mutation. So overall there has been a 80% reduction in the risk of disease recurrence or death with osimertinib, and adjuvant osimertinib actually demonstrated clinically meaningful survival in CMS DFS patients also, and the safety profile has been established with osimertinib with mild EGFR TK class effect reported. Median exposure to osimertinib was 72. So again, even whether you are giving it in after adjuvant chemotherapy or directly after resection is not going to make much of a difference. And overall health-related quality of life has been maintained with adjuvant osimertinib treatment with no clinically meaningful differences versus placebo despite the prolonged. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deepak, for actually presenting it in less than just a period of time. So, one thing which has been very fantastic with Edinburgh is that it is one of the landmark trials, and I think it's a practicing trial for all of us. And osimertinib actually, in fact, there is also an ongoing trial in the adjuvant CTRT trial also. I think that also will be really fascinating to see. One thing which I just, when I went through this trial, what is the impression of role of chemotherapy? So should we wait for chemotherapy, or for such patients should we give chemotherapy, or we should directly immediately check for EGFR mutation and only give osimertinib? What was your impression from this data?
Well, actually, really speaking, as I have already mentioned, that we are seeing only 10% of the patients actually reach in the resectable state. One more thing, that whether the osimertinib is affordable by them or not, that is very important for us. So definitely, if patient is affordable, I would like to offer it after.
Yeah, so I think there was a trend towards better survival when osimertinib was started, irrespective of chemotherapy, and it was in fact detrimental in the arm where chemotherapy was given and then osimertinib was started. So there was a suggestions towards starting osimertinib wherever possible after resection. So that was one key takeaway from this. Any other questions from the house? Any questions from any of the PGs there?
Certainly, as a radiation oncologist, I would never like to see the result of, I will never be interested in result of adjuvant CTRT versus osimertinib.
So it is after CTRT, adding osimertinib, that trial is ongoing. Like we have started using now durvalumab. Yeah, it has become actually standard of care. In fact, this will be really interesting, sir, because in adjuvant if it is working, in metastatic if it is working, definitely it should work in CTRT, but hopefully, let's see.
CTRT is
Post CPAT, sir. Not radiation is mandatory, sir. So, thank you so much, Dr. Deepak, for such wonderful presentation. And now we'll go to the last talk for today, and that will be by Dr. Amit Sherawat. He is also concerned medical oncologist in AIIMS Rishikesh, and he will be talking about the landscape of the recent advances in treatment of EGFR mutant non-small cell lung cancer in the medicine setting. Over to you, Dr. Amit.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Chairperson. Am I audible clearly? So, as we are already beyond our scripted time limit, so I will be rushing through few of the slides. And to start with, this is not a sponsored talk. Okay, I am nowhere associated with the sponsor. So this is a hardcore clinical and evidence-based talk. Though it will look like I am like enforcing for something, but actually this is not a sponsored talk. Okay. So this is my talk outline. This part was discussed by the previous speakers also. So this is lung cancer is actually a real public health issue for our Indian patients. Actually, this is the second most common malignancy throughout the world, and this is actually a main concern for us because majority of the patients they present in advanced metastatic patients. So rather we can say that majority of the patients they present in metastatic state. So they are presenting in incurable state. So disease burden is high, and they present with extensive disease burden for our practical purpose. So it's very important to see what sort of treatment options we have. So as Madam discussed in first talk, like 10 years, 15 years back, 15, 20 years back, the only choice we were having was just cytotoxic chemotherapy. But with the evolution of targeted therapy, immuno-oncological agents, so we are spoiled by the choice. So one of such scenario is targeting EGFR. So coming to the incidence of EGFR mutation, as Deepak sir already discussed, incidence is much more in Asian population. Like it was reported to up to 40%, 45% from Korea and Japan. Incidence from Indian studies, from our Indian experience, TMH experience, they are saying at least 1/4, like around 25% of the patients are still mutated in Indian population, which is actually higher than the Caucasian or Western population. And among the various subtypes, L858R and L820, 19, actually they constitute around 45-40% of it, and these two mutations constitute majority of the exon mutation subtypes throughout the world, including our Indian population. And this is important for our post-grad students. So there are these 3 generations of TKI which have been approved and which are actually practically used in this setting. So nothing is experimental. All the 3 settings they are approved and we are practically using. And osimertinib is the latest 3rd generation, and important point to focus on this is irreversible inhibitor. As compared to the first one, you can see they were reversible inhibitor and this is irreversible inhibitor. This is the major difference between us. And this is important slide. So for our younger colleagues, I would like to focus them on this first thing. First thing is the IPASS track. So this is very important to understand the history of IPASS track. So it was not a planned randomized control trial of chemotherapy versus targeted therapy. It was nothing like that. If we are selecting EGFR mutated population and we are giving Jepnin to that population, it was not like that. It was unselected population and they were given chemotherapy versus Jepnin. And actually that trial was a negative trial, nothing came out of it. But when retrospectively it was seen that those patients who were actually having benefit with the Jeptin, they were having EGFR mutation, and that difference was significant. So that thing started the that rolled the ball. Like, after that, we are having targeted therapy in each and every solid tumor. So that was 20 years back. And when it started, it was the initial PFS of 9.5 months in lung cancer stage 4. That was actually quite remarkable. And we started our journey from there. Now, in 3rd generation, you can see the first line EFS, we can see 18 months. So for 1.5 years, you need not to do anything. You just see the patient. See where the patient is having mutated EGFR, then you start targeting with the 3rd generation. And for majority of the patient, for 1.5 months, nothing else to be done. Patient will be controlled only on that treatment. So that is quite radical in terms of metastatic lung cancer patients. Because the 5-year survival rate in this population, we are expecting less than 5%, despite all our efforts. And now things are changing. So now there are so many treatment options. We saw that first generation, second generation. So how to choose and what are the things which you are going to decide on based on what your decisions are. Like for example, whether this particular drug is offering better PFS, better survival, better response rate, and it's important to focus on CNS metastasis in lung cancer because majority of the patient, more than 50% of the patient during the treatment course, they will have some CNS metastasis. So it's important to focus on that part. What is the toxicity profile? What is the impact on quality of life? So these all questions we actually address and deciding what sort of therapy we are going to offer to our patients. So coming to the first part, PFS. So these are landmark trials for afatinib, like Lux 7 for Tecotinib, Archer trial, Flora trial for osimertinib. So these are the landmark trials which I will be referring to again and again. And you can see the first line setting PFS, which is remarkable of 18.9 months with osimertinib as compared to the other two options. That's also not less. If you see, we are treating advanced metastatic disease. And for that, PFS of 11 months and 14.7 months is quite remarkable. But as compared to this lot, best of all the three options is going to be osimertinib if you are choosing based on PFS advantage. And that PFS advantage is across various mutation subtypes. So we will discuss exon 19 and LH5 are the most common mutations. So this PFS advantage is across all the mutation subtypes. So first thing is check. Now what about objective response rate? So among the all TKIs which are targeting EGFR, you can see the highest response rate can be seen with osimertinib. So around 70 to 80% response rate in the advanced metastatic setting is actually quite a remarkable thing. So for that matter, all the TKIs, they are actually very effective TKIs. So second point is also checked. Third point is for any oncological patients, the two most important oncological outcomes are survival and quality of life. If you want me to choose, first thing I will choose quality of life and second survival. So if we are not offering quality of life and even if you are offering survival, there is no benefit of it. So if you are offering quality of life wrong with survival, that's the best case scenario. So we can discuss PFS, we can discuss overall response rate, anything. But if at the end of the day, if there is no survival advantage, then there is no fun of offering that, especially if that much cost is involved. So coming to that, afatinib versus Tecotinib versus osimertinib. Although it's a cross-trial thing, but you can see the absolute number of 38.6 months versus 27.9 months. It's quite a difference of 10 months or so. So among all the TKI, this is offering highest survival in the first line setting. So third point is also checked. Fourth point, CNS metastasis. So as I discussed that around more than 50-60% of the patients throughout their life, when we are treating them for lung metastasis, they will have some CNS metastasis. So it's very important to focus on which TKI is effective more on CNS. And this lower part of PET, which is targeted with EGFR targeted drug, you can see that maximum CNS penetration can be seen by osimertinib. So this is a lab-based thing. But what is happening practically? Practically this is happening. So even with the metastasis, patients are having maximum outcomes, better outcomes with osimertinib as compared to the other TKI. And in this slide, I will like you to focus on Lux 7 also. In Lux 7, all the absolute number is less, but even with metastasis, brain metastasis, survival, median PFS survival was 7.2 months. So actually they were having quite inferior outcome as we are discussing the TKI. They are offering first line PFS of around 9 months to 11 months. So this is quite a number, 7.2 months. Now fourth thing is also checked. Fifth is quality of life and toxicity. In Dr. Deepak also discussing Flora, most of the toxicities are mild and well manageable. And across all TKI, they are actually well tolerated. EGFR TKI, we are not facing major issues other than the common toxicities which can be taken care of. And there are no major concern regarding grade 3, grade 4 toxicity. Except Tecotinib. Tecotinib was having this major issue of toxicity which led to frequent dose modifications. So among afatinib, decometinib or osimertinib, Tecotinib was actually the worst performing in terms of dose modification or dose reduction while patients were on treatment. So in terms of food safety profile for osimertinib, that part is also checked. Now the most important part, quality of life. You can see quality of life was actually maintained in initial TKI trials, and which is also maintained or rather improved with osimertinib. That's not the case with ecoternib. So that part is also checked. The last part is subsequent therapy. Now this is very important for resident to understand. If we start say X drug in upfront setting, and after that we are getting some certain, say for example in this scenario we are getting 18 months of PFS. And what if after that sequencing of other drugs and chemotherapy, overall survival remains same? Then what is the fun of offering that drug in upfront setting? You can offer later on also. Okay, if the cost is so much concerned, then offer initially cheaper options, then you can offer the alternative costly option the patient is affording. But that's not the case actually scientifically speaking. So those patients who are having first line osimertinib offers, they are actually faring bad. And you can understand this point that all those patients who were offered alternative TKI, majority of them were actually not a candidate for second line TKI because their quality of life deteriorated. So if you want to hit hard, then hit hard at the first time only. Don't wait for the second line only. And that has been seen through various trial and various publications that best option is to offer best active drug in the first line setting. And that is also applicable on osimertinib. So that last part is also checked. This slide I am going to move. So overall, this is the summary. Like, if we are considering all this permutation and combination, the osimertinib is actually checking every box except one. In Indian setting, that important box is cost. So if we remove that cost part of it, there is no doubt that osimertinib is the best drug. Okay, but 99% of our patients are actually not affording in our day-to-day practice, especially in public hospitals. So, are we doing some harm by not offering them those drugs? So, actually, I got two interesting slides. Those two slides are last slides and probably most important slides. This slide, this is a publication of 2020 only, just a few months back. So, this important to understand. This is real life data. This is not a trial data, and this is after drug got approval. And you can see afatinib is actually not doing that bad, especially those patients who are not having CNS metastasis. Okay, so you can see actually afatinib curve is above the osimertinib curve. So if patient is having L858R mutation, patient is not having brain metastasis, and if we are offering afatinib, so actually you are doing pretty fine. So don't worry about that. And the last part of my talk is this last slide. This is interesting. And this is interesting more because the initial data came from our Indian population only, from TMS only. What if we combine TKI with chemotherapy? So if we combine TKI with chemotherapy, then upfront PFS is around 16 to 18 months, in line with that upfront first line osimertinib. And that has been proven in at least 2-3 trials. And this is interesting meta-analysis which was published a couple of months back. And more than 1200 population was included, and they concluded that offering those patients with good performance score, TKI plus chemotherapy combination will offer superior PFS, objective response rate, as well as survival, overall survival. So I would like to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amit, for actually covering it very extensively and in a very, I would say, pragmatic manner, so that our PGs could actually understand as to what are the options which are available to affordable patient and also a patient who cannot afford. So thank you so much. So if there are any questions, we are open to questions.
Otherwise, we can discuss those questions in our
Panel discussion.
Okay, so now it's time for the panel discussion, and I invite Dr. Satya as the moderator for the next panel discussion, and I will leave the seat for the panelists.
Sir, ठंड बहुत लगा दी सर उन्हें. It's been very chilling here, so difficult to sit, and I think sir was actually waiting कि कब नीचे जाए तो please serve snacks to sir. It's been very chilling here. So without wasting more time, because we are already running late, so Dr. Amit, please have your seat. I'll call Dr. Aparna. Without you, the panel cannot be complete, because all we are talking is all molecular to begin with and end to end also. Dr. Aparna will be here, and I'll also invite Dr. Saurabh Bansal. Dr. Saurabh Bansal, yeah, and Dr. S. Narayanan, sir. So it completes a panel. We have molecular oncologist, medical oncologist, we have our respiratory surgeon and radiation oncologist, and sir is pulmonologist, and we have our other team members here. So I'll actually be not wasting much time. We just have a small case-based discussion. I hope that today evening it has been really a kind of an understanding to how the management of EGFR positive lung cancer has been evolving. So can we have mics here? We have mics here. So I'll offer my mic to the panelists and just continue here. So the first case is a 65-year-old lady who came with left pleuritic chest pain for 1 month. So she has got a left lower mass. It's a hypothetical case. 5.5 centimeter invades the pleura. Subcentimetric right paratracheal and left hilar lymph nodes. Left pleural thickening and effusion. The histopathology report said that it is an adenocarcinoma, and the diagnosis of left lower lung mass, clinically T3, N3, M1, left pleural metastasis was made. PDL expression came earlier, it was done by ISC. So at third day of diagnosis, PDL expression was found to be 55%, and EGFR mutation results are awaited. So I'll ask Dr. Amit, how would you manage such patient?
So practically, even irrespective of PDL expression, if we are not able to offer immunotherapy agents, then we start with cytotoxic chemotherapy.
No. So
Even if we are anticipating EGFR mutation, still we start with the first cycle, and later on when we are having the mutation, then we decide on the target.
Okay. So normally in our practice, when we are medical oncologists, we either see whether how much symptomatic the patient, not very symptomatic. We can wait 4 to 5 days. We usually end up waiting for the EGFR report, especially with women with adenocarcinoma, especially a non-smoker. If the patient is very symptomatic, we start with the chemotherapy, and then either switch over to, mostly we switch over to EGFR directed therapy once the report is available. Also, PD-L1 expression at this point of time, if it is EGFR negative, definitely has a strong bearing, because if a patient who has got PD-L1 expressive tumor more than 50%, they are highly likely to respond to immunotherapy. So that can be one option. But yes, we are also happy to send a gene panel. So madam, just for everybody here in Dehradun, if somebody sends a sample to Core Diagnostics, so what is your turnaround time? Tomorrow morning, if Core is able to get the things picked up from here, so by what time can you get us a molecular diagnostic panel for patients from Dehradun? How much time does Core Diagnostics take?
15 days, right?
15 days is the
15
working days, or total 15 days?
15 working days.
15 working days. And could you just tell us, like, there are certain components which you can make it early for us? Like
So it
EGFR.
depends what you're doing. So if you're going to be doing NGS within 15 days, you will have your result, which will give you all that information. Then if you are doing the reflex panel, if that's what you're asking for, then I think between 7 to 8 days you get EGFR. If that's negative, then it goes on to ALK, then it goes on to ROS1, the usual format.
Okay. So many of us at New Delhi also, or when we have our low labs, or we are sending to Core Diagnostics or similar labs, we actually end up getting the first ones quicker, because we know ALK, PD-L1 can be done with as early as 2 to 3 days, and EGFR sooner it can be done. Now we have some diagnostic kits also. Do you have those kits with you?
We do have the EGFR prime, which is between 24 to 48 hours.
So
we do
now-
get those reports,
Yeah.
but EGFR is done first before we do the other biomarkers.
Okay, so EGFR especially we can get it done within 72 hours. So it's now very much possible, if we have the will, we can actually be after them and they can make the things speed up for us. So that's one thing which we, and NGS, which is nowadays almost coming into the clinical practice for many of the oncologists, is as quickly done in 2 weeks. It's a very good time frame compared to the Western world also. So is these things available to us even in Delhi or now in
Pan India.
Pan India. Okay. So one thing which I think a lot of questions for you. So what tissue diagnosis would you prefer? So I'll first ask Amit, and then I'll ask you. Then I'll see what is the concordance.
Most easily accessible first.
Most easily accessible first.
Yeah.
So
But there's a primary
that choice
metastatic.
would that choice be different for you?
Is it the better or the?
I ideally prefer the new metastatic side. I like it from the metastatic side, but you know, whatever's
whatever you
accessible.
said, she has to do it.
Well,
So now one more question which we have very commonly been frequently asking. Our patients come to us, sir, liquid biopsy कर दो. मतलब we don't know, they also they can give a liquid biopsy करिए sir, हमने liquid biopsy के बारे में पढ़ा है. So how comfortable are we doing liquid biopsies? Doctor, you in your practice are you using some liquid biopsies?
No, I would like to prefer a tissue biopsy first.
Tissue biopsy, yes. Preferably like Dr. Mishra was getting from the e-bus.
Yes.
That's what we have.
Regarding the site of tissue biopsy, I think Dr. Mike would agree with me. A peripheral 1/3 we go for a CT direct biopsy, a middle 1/3 you can choose between the two, and the central 1/3 you go endobronchial biopsy.
Yes, yes.
That is what it is.
Yeah.
And the primary is always listing as far as ma'am is concerned. I think
She is happier with metastatic disease. So what about liquid biopsy? What is your take on liquid
If I
biopsy?
don't get a sample or if I'm not able to get it during endoscopy, then I will go for the second.
So what is the current role for liquid biopsy in metastatic non-small cell lung cancer? To reframe the question, is there a role or there is no role? Is there a role, Dr. Amit?
Yes, sir. Practically we are offering, but now offering are restricted usually to those patients who are not suited for routine biopsy procedure and everything. Practically we are doing for those
So I
patients.
think he's right upfront, mostly no. Recurrent disease, burden is high, we like to get an NGS later on, the patient not ready to get a NGS right now, he's saying a biopsy, then is the role for liquid biopsy. So patient progressing on first time treatment, tissue not adequate, or the physician says, okay, let's try liquid biopsy. I have had liquid biopsy in some of my patients. They have provided answers to us on liquid biopsy. So I think liquid biopsy has got a role, especially there was a lot of data with T790M mutations, especially 2-3 years back when we used to send for osimertinib. So osimertinib was not the first line, it used to be second line, and then there was a lot of debate about first liquid biopsies and go for biopsy, all those things. But yes, liquid biopsy not only in lung cancer, many other cancers, definitely coming up in a big way. I think with more expertise, it will be a part of the many cancer treatment. So now I'll ask you again, sir, what is your diagnostic tools which you commonly use for a lung cancer for staging workup?
CCT test supplement with an MRI brain.
Okay, okay. These three modalities. Dr. Amit, anything different from this or this fine?
So practically lung patients they present with CT scan reports. Because when they come with the CT scan reports. So we start with the metastatic workup in terms of offering them PET CT and MRI brain.
Dr. Saurabh, for lung cancer, PET scan or CT scans?
No, upfront we would like to do a CT scan at home, but if we are suspecting a metastatic disease or high burden of disease, we would like to go for a PET CT.
Any role of MRI brain?
Yes, of course, there is a role of MRI brain.
Which patients?
I think every patient, adenocarcinoma or a non-small cell carcinoma lung should go for a MRI brain because a lot of patients are asymptomatic. They have an asymptomatic brain mets.
If the patient shows PET scan shows only local disease, you have done EVA surgical candidate, still you have to go or not?
Yes, I would like to go for MRI brain.
So I think MRI has come into the primary part of. So you can have the imaging of the brain. MRI is preferred, but yes, CT scan also is fine. A contrast CT scan or MRI. But among the all imaging tests we all have. So PET scan is preferred over CT scans, but yes, I think
Only exception for MRI brain is stage 1A, which practically we don't see.
Yes.
So practical purpose, every patient should be subjected to MRI.
So now PD-L1 was positive, and after 5 days, Dr. Amit he waited actually. He said, let me get the test done. I'll not start chemotherapy. This report came, EGFR exon del 19. So after his lovely talk, Dr. Amit, the patient has come to you to AIMS but has no financial issues. He has come to you because of your merit. He has heard your name. They want the best treatment from you.
So now we are having adequate data to support that notion that those patients with EGFR mutation positive status, they actually don't respond that well to immunotherapeutic agents.
Okay.
So even if they are having high PDL expression, still I would like to offer them first line osimertinib if they are not having any financial.
So he's asking immunotherapy too, so you're saying no immunotherapy. Then he
Now
asking to do what?
We are having comfortable data sets. They are suggesting that immunotherapy agents, they are not that effective in terms of survival benefit for those who are having EGFR mutation, even irrespective of PD-L1 expression.
So these are all your choices. So immunotherapy you ruled out. Now among your all the choices which you say, you tick all the 7 boxes, and 8 box I tick for it for you. Patient has no issue. He is the richest person in Dehradun.
Still, that doesn't matter. Our choices will be science-based, not.
No, science as well as finance.
Yeah.
Both are on your side.
So I would like to offer him osimertinib first.
Okay. So I think Dr. Amit is inclined. If the finances are there, then definitely he'll like to offer osimertinib. If finance is not there, then what will be your choice among all the other available options?
Then most important thing is going to be patient's performance score. How good patient's performance score is. Patient
Performance fitness is good. And then among other TKIs versus TKI plus chemotherapy or TKI versus VEGF. So what will be your choice?
So if patient performance score is fit and or patient is not affording osimertinib, I would like to offer him first line TKI plus chemotherapy, TMS protocol. And although we are having data of VEGF inhibitor, but the data quality is relatively inferior.
So it is really interesting. It will be interesting over the next 2 years to see. And one more thing which will happen is, in fact, having osimertinib along with chemotherapy. So we'll have osimertinib plus chemotherapy, osimertinib alone, and first or second generation TKIs with chemotherapy. So I think these answers we'll find in the future. So we have these 2 options. So no constraints. I think best to put them on osimertinib. Why? Because overall toxicity profile favors osimertinib alone versus chemotherapy plus first generation, because toxicity is high. In fact, if you just think of IPAS study, the arm which had both chemo plus Defnet did not do that well. So there is some data with TMH and the Japanese and the Chinese data, but then yes, that is really interesting. So this Amit is already answered, so I think he already knows a lot of answers. And this I'll just skip it because a lot of things. Effectively, this has already been mentioned in the previous 2 slides. I'll just come to the point. Safety has been discussed. One more important thing which has been there, which I think radiation oncologists colleagues have to involve them, is the role of asymptomatic brain metastasis. So, sir, asymptomatic brain metastasis in lungs, sir, how do you do you get results from medical oncologists? कि सर आप देखिए क्या करना है? तो सर, how do we manage asymptomatic brain metastasis? आप, sir, you could answer that. So.
If a patient present, we need to check whether he has limited or extensive metastasis. If there are limited metastasis, we can go for a surgical section followed by SRS, or if surgical section not possible, we can directly go for SRS. And if there are extensive brain mets, we can go for full brain EBRT.
So, how many of us actually prefer going for surgery, surgical resections versus SRS? That is my question from radiation oncologist. You could answer and then Amit could answer that. Amit, are you comfortable getting brain metastasis removed? Though there is data which shows that resection of a solitary tumor. So are you more comfortable offering them only SRS?
Yes, sir. For practical answer is yes, because that's a non-invasive technique, and we are having data that is quite good data, and that data is still evolving. And that is showing that quality of life is better maintained and survival benefit is also there. Yeah. So why not just offer non-invasive SRS than offering that neurosurgery sort of thing, which is having inherent mortality issues concerns.
I think one of the very important key takeaways from today's talk should be that these EGFR positive patients could have asymptomatic brain metastasis. In brain imaging should be done, and we should not worry. Even if there are brain metastasis, they are the responses to osimertinib as well as local RT is fantastic. So I think the NCCN guideline also has suggested that go for stereotactic reduced surgery and start osimertinib right away. So if both the things are done together, I think they can have, I would not say comparable, but then I would have reasonably well survival compared to anybody who has been exposed to first or second generation TKIs, or first generation with chemotherapy, or second generation drugs. So this is one subset where osimertinib really scores over the other competitors. So I think in the interest of time, I'll stop it here only. And any other points which any of you would like to make the panelists or the house. So we'll be happy to answer those questions. Dr. Verma, sir, any expert comments or any points which you like to?
I think everything is being covered only with so my was based like
few patients who want to save money, let us try save this osimertinib for the later. But problems are because most of the time patient is not agreeing for biopsy and the tissue is not available and it may not be sufficient. So at that time detection of any new mutation, it may be very difficult. So although man can have this liquid biopsies, so but ideally we should be looking for
Next time she'll have some more new things for us.
sequencing is actually one debatable thing.
So I think you put very valid points on the sequencing.
Circumstances, yeah.
So Dr. Amit, yeah, sequencing. Resource constraint, no non-resource constraint.
So sequencing, I presented the data set. Upfront, you hit it hard. Like, if you are having option of osimertinib, irrespective of everything, you offer osimertinib first, then alternative option. If patient is not affording, then you can plan sequencing.
Say for example, if you give Jeftinib and you get 6 to 7 months, and then you add osimertinib, then the total cumulative amount may go what the osimertinib can give. But actually,
Mathematically, you are correct, sir. But we have seen from the data that's actually not correct.
Okay.
And
So,
I have one query. I have one question for our audience and for me.
Yeah.
So, although we say they are mutually exclusive, EGFR, but practically we do see patients those who are in both mutations. And it's actually not that rare that we anticipate. So how you approach to those patients who are in both L positive as well as EGFR positive?
So you have an expert sitting next to you. I think she knows a lot of things. She gets these cases quite commonly from all of us. You could answer that.
Okay, we'll try. You can actually look at the variant allele frequency that actually helps you understand as to which is the oncogenic driver mutation. That's one way. Some cases we've also seen where a combination of both get given, both the TKIs get given, especially when they're neck to neck and you really can't understand. It's not very clear, it's not very evident which is the oncogenic driver mutation. But more importantly, I think it's going back to looking at the history. Was the patient a smoker, non-smoker, age, looking at factoring that information in also helps understand in some cases. But it is kind of a predicament for all of us because with NGS, this is new data which you're starting to see the recombinant genes coming together. So we are also still trying to understand, can we give them in combination? But for now, the safest way is looking at the variant allele frequency and deciding on that who's leading it.
And Amit wants to.
So we are not having that answer. Which one is driver mutation?
Yeah, we don't know. In fact,
When patient is with us in OPD, so how we are going to decide that
So we started with ALK inhibitors first, and then when the patient started some progression, then we added, we actually started added because both the drugs were too much financial toxicity for the patient.
So actually I had that review of literature, although data is small, 12 patients, 6 patients, and they are actually saying the other way around. You target EGFR first, and you target EGFR followed by L, and then although number is small, just 12.
Yeah, I think there are some case reports.
Yeah.
It's not standardized. That's why I said that while you can do that, I do sometimes spot both together and
Both
patient is
together.
having a response. But I still think that it's better looking at the molecular, who is driving that tumor. I think that's
So, are there anything else? Any expert comments, questions? Amit?
Okay, thank you, sir. Sorry, sir.
Well, if there are no more questions, sir. So, thank you so much, all of you, for such lovely. I think it has been a very fantastic learning meeting for all of us, and we all have ended up learning more and more and how to manage our patients better. And I hope that we have key takeaways from this meeting. And I'll say hand over mic to you, sir, to have the final comments and.
Yeah. I would like to thank everyone and Dr. Sajjan, Dr. Aparna coming from Delhi, taking time out of their busy schedule. At the same time, I would like to introduce to the house Dr. Sunil Saini, who could not make it in time for him to come to the dais. And please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
I would request to present a memento and so I would request Dr. Saini to give the memento to all the speakers and panelists. Dr. Manoj and Dr. Saini, please. Dr. Saini to kindly give a bouquet to Dr. Manoj Gupta. Dr. Manoj Gupta.
सर पहले आपको ही आना चाहिए। फोटो यार फोटो नहीं खींच रहा सही लाइव रिकॉर्डिंग कर रहा है।
Dr. Aparna, please. Dr. Amit. Dr. S. Narayan. Dr. Sajjan Raj.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
May I invite Dr. Mayank Mishra to the dais. Dr. Deepak Sundariyal. Anybody here? Dr. S. Narayan. Dr. Manoj to give a bouquet to Dr. Saini. Thanks to AstraZeneca, Core Diagnostic and Max DLT for making this event a big success.
Sir, let me do the honors, sir. आप दोनों के बुके तो बच्चे में सर प्लीज सर आप यस सर आइए सर सर इधर Thank you so much, and I think we all can. The house is open for drinks and dinner.